Hello again everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now today I'm finally getting round to covering the Roman story of our nation's capital. Before London was London, before Westminster, St Paul's or the Underground, there was a river, a crossing and a dream. 2,000 years ago, the Romans came to a river and created a city that would become the heart of Britain. But London did not survive unscathed. In less than 20 years, it was burned to the ground. This is the story of London's birth, its early life and the destruction that nearly ended it before it became the capital of Roman Britain. This is the story of Londinium. Before we step onto the banks of the Thames, it's worth asking a simple question. Why is London called London? Well, the truth is, we don't really know for sure. The Latin name, used by the Romans, Londinium, survives in texts and inscriptions, but its origins are mysterious. For centuries, storytellers tried to make sense of it. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his History of the Kings of Britain, claimed the city was named after a legendary founder, Lud, son of Heli. A heroic tale, but there's no actual evidence that Lud existed. Modern scholars instead believe that the name comes from a native Brittonic place name, probably something like Londinium. 2,000 years ago, the Thames flowed through a wide, marshy landscape of mudflats, streams and low hills. There were no skyscrapers, no stone bridges, no great city, just water, reeds, forests and open ground. And yet, this place already mattered. The Thames was not just a river, it was a highway, a boundary and a source of food and trade. But it was also sacred. For centuries before the Romans arrived, people had been throwing objects into the Thames deliberately, not lost by accident, but as votive offerings to the gods. Weapons, tools, jewellery and decorated metalwork have been dredged from the Thames, showing that this waterway was a place of ritual, memory and meaning. Among the most famous is the Battersea Shield. This bronze shield, decorated with swirling patterns and red enamel inlay, was never meant for battle. It was a prestige object, carefully made to display wealth and status, and then deliberately thrown into the river. Scholars date it to around the 1st century BC, possibly at the time of Julius Caesar's expeditions to Britain. Other finds, like swords, spearheads and ritualised tools, suggest that the Thames and its tributaries were a sacred boundary, perhaps marking territorial claims, asserting power, or asking for divine favour. People may have crossed these waters cautiously, aware that the river had both practical and spiritual significance. The landscape around the Thames was lightly settled. Small villages and farmsteads dotted slightly raised ground above the floodplain. Streams like the Walbrook crisscrossed the land, providing fresh water and marking natural boundaries. This area was strategically important. Fertile land, access to inland routes, and a river that could carry goods into the far interior of southern Britain. But it was not a political centre. There was no Iron Age hill fort here, no fortified tribal capital. Unlike many Roman towns in southern and eastern Britain that grew out of existing Iron Age centres, such as Londinium or Verulamium, Londinium was founded by the Romans at a strategic river crossing, rather than replacing a large native settlement. Across Britain as a whole, other important towns like Eboracum and Lindum Colonia were also Roman foundations, but in the dense tribal landscape of the south, London's planned beginning set it apart. The first Romans to see this landscape were soldiers. In 55 and 54 BC, Julius Caesar led 2 invasions of Britain, and on his second campaign, his army crossed the Thames whilst pursuing Cassivellaunus, the leader of the Brittonic forces. Caesar describes Brittonic warriors trying to block the river with sharpened stakes, forcing Roman soldiers to wade chest deep through the water. However, Caesar did not build a city. He did not leave a garrison. He didn't bridge the Thames. But the Romans now knew the river intimately. They understood the Thames' strategic importance, knowledge that would come in very handy in the Claudian invasion nearly a century later. Caesar's expeditions also brought trade and cultural contact. Even a temporary presence opened Britain to Roman goods, coins, and ideas. It's possible that objects like the Battersea Shield or other votive offerings were deposited during this period, when the Thames was first observed by the wider Mediterranean world. Nearly a century later, the Romans returned, this time for permanent conquest. In 43 AD, under Emperor Claudius and Aulus Plautius, a full-scale invasion force landed in southern Britain. The goal was not to raid, but permanent occupation. Legions advanced inland, defeating tribal armies, building roads and forts, and securing the land. The army faced a practical problem almost immediately, however. They needed to cross the Thames. The river was wide, tidal, and difficult to ford, but at one particular spot the banks narrowed, the ground was firm, and several natural routes converged. This was the place where the Romans would build Londinium. Initially, it may have been a military bridgehead, controlling river crossings and establishing authority. But almost immediately, something else developed: a port. Timber quays were driven into the riverbank, warehouses were constructed, roads and drains were laid, and by somewhere between 47 and 50 AD, it was already a functioning settlement, alive with trade, commerce, and the movement of people. Unlike towns such as Camulodunum, Verulamium and Corinium, Londinium was designed by the Romans from the ground up. It was not inherited from a previous native capital. It was a planned settlement for control, trade and administration. Archaeology has shown us timber buildings lined along streets, workshops producing metalwork, and quays lined with warehouses. Amphorae carried wine, olive oil and other imports from Gaul and the Mediterranean, and in return Britain exported grain, metal, wool and hides. Imagine walking the streets of early Londinium. The air smells of river mud, smoke from fires and the tang of goods from across the empire. Dock workers shout as they haul crates from ships. Soldiers march through the streets, enforcing order. Merchants haggle over imported pottery and bronze coins. Taverns are crowded with traders, craftsmen and visitors. Timber houses creak, narrow streets are crowded, and life is vibrant but precarious. And a huge fire could destroy an entire area. And as history would show, it eventually would. The population is diverse. Roman citizens, Latin-speaking merchants from Gaul, local Britons seeking opportunity, and slaves working in warehouses and households. Everyday life is rough but lively. Trade, communication and social networks are already flourishing, creating a cosmopolitan hub on the Thames. During this time of early Roman Britain, Londinium was not the capital of Roman Britain. That title belonged to Camulodunum, modern Colchester, a former tribal capital transformed into a Roman colony with a large temple to Emperor Claudius. And at this time, Roman rule was harsh. Tribal lands had been seized, local elites humiliated, and taxes imposed. And when the king of the Iceni, Prasutagus, died and his widow Boudica tried to secure her family's position, she was instead flogged and her daughters raped and her kingdom annexed. The rebellion that followed was brutal and decisive. The rebels first struck Londinium, overwhelming its defences and destroying the city and slaughtering the inhabitants. The temple of Claudius was sacked and burnt. Then the rebels moved south to Londinium. The governor of the time, Suetonius Paulinus, reached Londinium with his army, but the city was young, exposed, and lightly fortified. So he decided not to defend it, so he withdrew, and Boudica's forces entered Londinium. Ancient sources describe slaughter, fire, and devastation. Timber streets were engulfed in flames, workshops and warehouses reduced to ash. Men, women, and children were all killed. And archaeology confirms the horror. We have found a thick burn layer dating to the early 60s AD, of charred timber foundations, flattened streets, destroyed quays. We've even found human remains, particularly along the Walbrook, showing blunt force trauma and blade wounds. Londinium, barely 2 decades old, was almost erased. The destruction was not only physical but psychological, a warning that Roman power was not unchallenged and that this riverside settlement was vulnerable. Yet Londinium did not vanish. After Boudica's rebellion was crushed, the Romans rebuilt Londinium very carefully, designing it for order and defence. A forum and basilica were built, the administrative and commercial heart of the town, and gradually timber gave way to stone. Quays and warehouses were rebuilt, markets, workshops and public spaces flourished. Trade resumed, drawing merchants from across the empire. Out of the ashes, Londinium became more than a port. It became the political and administrative centre of Roman Britain. And that, the city that rose from destruction, is where most stories of Roman London usually begin. But this is only part 1. Tomorrow, as a special treat, on the anniversary of my channel going live, I'll be continuing the story of Londinium, not as a fragile frontier settlement, but as a fully fledged Roman capital. And that story begins in part 2, which you can find on here tomorrow. But thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe. It helps immensely, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Ciao ciao for now.